We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. And today we're doing a wrap-up of Season 2. It's hard to believe.
It really is. It really is. It's been amazing. A lot of fun. Really enjoyed it.
So before we jump in, I just wanted to bring up a technical issue that some of our listeners may have run into. Something we discovered was that the various platforms may not always have the same quality of audio recording, whether it's Apple or Spotify, or if you download a podcast from our own website. So if perchance you download an episode and the audio quality is not great, I would suggest downloading that episode from a different site and see if the quality is any better. This may be just a one-off thing that we've encountered, but it could be an issue, and we want everyone to have a good listening experience.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Chris. And so a lot of you are probably doing this already, but I'm very new to AI. So I did a little experiment. I actually put into ChatGPT all the titles of our podcast to see what the themes, what the threads were across Season 2. And it came up with some really good titles. So I thought we're going to sort of weave these into our conversation today. So the first one is that we've had conversations which challenge norms and definitions, and I think that's really accurate. We've had conversations around self-discovery and authenticity, personal growth and empowerment, relationships and interpersonal dynamics, most definitely, as always, equity, fairness, and social justice, and finally, most obviously, about mental health and well-being. And so, yes, our various conversations have all, I think, touched on these 6 subsections. So we will, weave those into the conversation as we go through each episode, talking about what we've learned, what's been inspiring, what are our key takeaways from this fantastic Season 2.
And we have great appreciation for all our guests who were willing to come on and chat with us. We've had the exceptional privilege of meeting with, interacting with, laughing and crying with just some fabulous people who are doing amazing work in their respective fields. And obviously, we can't do this podcast without them. So we're grateful to them.
Absolutely. So many smart people. I've learned so much from them, and incredibly generous to give their time and their knowledge to all of us. Brilliant.
Starting the season with Dr. Steve Hayes, who was my mentor when I was just a pup. And he had, the wild and crazy rant about there's no such thing as normal.
Wow. Yeah, what a way to kick off the season. Yes, that was an incredible conversation and very validating, because I do think the myth of normal has debilitated many of us and continues to do so. This idea that there is a normal and that we should strive to be normal in every possible way. It is a myth, and it can be a curse.
And as he described in his, in the podcast, the word normal wasn't even in common usage until the mid-1800s. And a lot of the statistics that psychologists use to categorize people and decide, with cutoff scores, who's deviant and who's not, a lot of those statistics were devised to study crop yields, comparing, one plot of land to another. So it's all group data, and the individual gets lost. And, the idea that one size fits all is not good when it comes to things like, psychotherapy or any kind of healthcare. So that's been Dr. Hayes's most recent endeavor, and what he'll spend the rest of his career, his life doing, is trying to find ways of helping people as individuals and, contextualizing and customizing treatments.
Yeah, it was very empowering. This idea that actually, as individuals and with all our complexities and all our experiences, we can really find the answers within us. So when it comes to sort of working with a therapist, when it comes to reading self-help material, when it comes to listening to podcasts, seeing it really as a perspective and not necessarily the right perspective, that it really is so incredibly individual what may work for you and what may help you, and having that courage and confidence to listen to your experience versus getting swayed by what other people's experience is. Especially when you get these, people in positions of authority. Well, we'll be talking about narcissism in a minute, but people in have very strong opinions about what's right and wrong and what should be normal and seen as good outcomes may not be the right ones for you.
Exactly. And as we'll talk about later with siblings, comparison can be a real problem.
Yes.
But as always, check out the show notes for each episode where you can find resources. And there are many in the show notes for Steve Hayes's fabulous talk.
Yes, it really was a great way to kick off. And then our next episode was with the fabulous Kristen Campbell, who's actually was with us in season 1 as well. And in that conversation, we talked about our sexual selves. And it was a very, I think, much needed conversation. And especially in this day and age where we're concerned about social media and children and what they have access to, being able to have these conversations with children from a young age is really important. And there are a lot of taboos. In fact, I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, and he was talking about, if we talk about sex with children from a young age, aren't we instilling curiosity and a desire to actually engage in those acts? But the research shows the complete opposite, that when we educate our children about sex and sexual parts, obviously age related, we can't be teaching very young children about a lot of the details of sex, but starting to educate them about sex really empowers them and keeps them safe. They're less likely to engage in underage sex. So it's actually the opposite. The more they know, the less likely they are to get into unsafe situations. So it's really important.
Yeah, I don't think curiosity needs to be taught to children.
True. Yes, you're absolutely right. And then the other piece that was really important was this ability to have more open conversations with ourselves, with our partners about our sexual needs. And I think that that's a huge taboo. And starting early reduces the awkwardness and makes it more acceptable. And the piece around we are responsible for our own sexual pleasure and sexuality is so powerful. That was a really important message.
And that includes being responsible for our sexual behavior, which is, again, something to teach children.
100%. And actually, that's also, we'll be having the conversation about victim blame, but that comes into that too.
Well, yeah, these common themes. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. But yes, understanding responsibility and choice, consent, what we want and what we like will empower us in our relationships going forward. Really important, actually, topic, albeit one that, is difficult, and we will need to learn how to get more comfortable having these conversations with our partners, with ourselves, and with our children, really.
Or, as we often say in acceptance commitment therapy, to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yes, my goodness. Yeah. Jill talked about that, didn't she, in season 1? And she had all these great examples on how she practices that, strengthening that muscle by going on roller coasters and eating all these odd tasting sweets. Do you remember? But yeah, it is true. It is a muscle.
Well,
Actually, not something that I need to get comfortable doing.
yeah. As Dr. Z talked about perfectionism.
It was a great conversation. That was super fun. That was super fun.
It was very interesting. And she talked about the drivers of perfectionism, which are caring, fear of failure, and then certain rules that we may be laboring under. And so she was saying we need to become aware of our processes and to unpack where we're stuck and why, what are our drivers. And she had a number of questions to consider. Is it a rule that we're following, or is it a principle? You know, is it more values driven, or is it more, I must do this or something will happen? And then micro choice points, asking ourselves, why am I doing this now? And am I a maximizer or a satisfizer? I thought that was brilliant.
Brilliant. So true.
And then chasing outcomes or chasing process or going after process. I've often, worked with students who, the parents are like saying, I'll give you $100 for each A you get at the end of the semester. And by the time the grades come out, it's too late. So I would instead say, let's work on the day-to-day processes that will get you the optimal outcome. But things can intervene that, you have no control over. So we have so little control over the outcome.
That's
very
right.
often in many situations. So it's a matter of what can I focus on? What do I have control over? And that's often the day-to-day process.
Absolutely. And sometimes when we chase the outcome, like, for example, making people happy, making people like us, and we don't get it, it can be incredibly hurtful and disappointing. And actually chasing outcomes is something that leads to burnout, really. That we keep focusing just on how to finish that project, how to get that, well, whatever it might be, a salary or a position. And yeah, we can get burnt out pretty quickly.
And that's, again, where comparison comes in. I finished the project, but it's just not good enough. I'm not good enough, etc.
Yes.
And I thought it was very important when she talked about dealing with perfectionism is not a question of letting go of our standards or not caring anymore.
Yes, so important. And when working with perfectionists, that's often what they're told. And it's incredibly difficult and painful because they're often told, well, stop caring so much. Why are you so bothered by, having the best party? Or I remember her example of her TVs, which was fantastic. Having the best TV. Well, we just can't stop caring. That is not the solution to the problem.
It's being flexible.
Yeah.
And then I loved what she said, dancing with what life brings you.
I've used that so much. And people really get that because it's true, because life will give you all kinds of experiences and you need to be able to, change your dance, adapt to it.
Yeah. It might not be what you were expecting.
No, it could be better.
Could be.
Potentially.
Yeah, it could be something you need, maybe even if it's not something you want.
Yes, exactly.
And then we had Stephen Batchelor. What an honor.
Oh boy. Yes. I came across him. I remember when I was finishing my thesis, I read his book, Good and Evil. And I didn't know much about Buddhism at that time. That must be, oh my goodness, 20 years ago. Yes, 20 years ago. I picked up his book and I loved it.
He's an amazing
It felt so
writer.
liberating. He's an amazing writer. Yes, he really is. The way he can simplify really difficult topics is incredible. I mean, that's such a brilliant skill.
So we talked about good and evil.
We did.
As two poles on a spectrum, and that life is often in the messy middle.
Yes. And how much we want to pull on one or the other. like we get really binary, don't we? We want to be on the good side and not see any of the evil. But actually that can shut down, change our perspective. Actually, that can narrow our perspective quite considerably and make us really quite rigid, black and white.
Again, all these themes overlapping, as we'll talk about with Jonathan Caspi and Siblings, your identity is often the opposite of somebody else's identity, and so if I'm one of the good people, then there's got to be some of the bad people out there. And so we get into dividing the world into us and them, the good people, the bad people. And, we know historically what happens when that gets adopted.
Yeah, it's very tribal. We touched on that we are so tribal in the way that we like to think. We like to think that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And actually, one of the superpowers, and we talked about that with Robin Walser in the Narcissism podcast, is our ability to cooperate. But that feels a bit like a Jedi skill sometimes. Like being able to integrate somebody else's perspective when their perspective just feels so wrong is really hard. And I mean, we see that obviously politically, but we can also see that in terms of families and relationships, like it.
No, we don't. And he talked about life being uncertain, and that we can never be. He said a moral choice can never be certain, and that it takes courage to take these moral risks. And as we talked about with Elisabeth Lati with Sisu, a lot of times this is a leap of faith that we, because we don't know sometimes what the outcome is going to be, and particularly in parenting, what they call a wicked environment, one where the contingencies are not real obvious or clear or immediate. We don't know if the thing we said to our child is going to inspire them or crush their soul.
Absolutely. Going back to that perfectionism, right? It's all about the process and not the outcome.
Yeah.
We need to sort of be mindful of what we want instead of getting caught up in the labels. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or is this a good person or a bad person? Even though our very reptilian brain likes to categorize.
Oh, yeah. Certainty.
Certainty and predictability and knowing who's with me and who's not with me. But to be it was so great because I sort of start trying to figure out, what's the answer then? How do we move forward with this tendency of ours to become so categorical and sort of rejecting? Do we just, need to start being more compassionate and more open to seeing a different perspective? And he talked about how, we just need to actually accept that the way humans are has got us really an incredible amount of development and success. So saying that, in order for us to continue to evolve, we need to do something so different actually undermines everything that we've achieved to an extent. He was saying that actually humans with this binary view, with this tendency, have also done an incredible amount. We, of course, so not to sort of get stuck on striving all the time, again, actually to be cognizant of what we've achieved and to recognize that there's a lot of good. Because I was in the conversation noticing that I was focusing very much on what I saw as the bad that's happening in the world. And he said not to sort of ignore the good. Again, that tendency to become quite binary.
Right. And that these struggles that we have at all these different levels are opportunities to help us, recognize and examine, refine our ethics and our rules and evolve.
Yes. And I loved what he said that, the 60s were such a time of revolution, having come out of the sort of Second World War, and everybody was very bold and courageous. And he thought that we're heading for another revolution. It's quite optimistic. I like that. He felt this new
depending
generation.
on which side of the revolution you're on.
True. But yeah, I was empowered by that, more positive. Because yes, it's true. We can get really fixated on the things we want to change and lose sight of the things that are going well.
Oh.
So yes, then we had a brilliant conversation with Katie Palmer on favorite child. A big worry for many parents, and with sort of right reason. Like we went on to converse with Jonathan Casby about the impact of favoritism, it being one of the biggest factors when it comes to sibling rivalry. It is the perception of there being a favorite child. And so that was a really important conversation that we had with Katie.
And most parents are reluctant to admit that they have a favorite child, but it's also a fluid thing where,
yes,
which child at which time, depending on circumstances. I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
Or near and dear to your children's hearts.
Definitely. I'd like it not to be anywhere near my heart. But yes, I agree. It is. As soon as you've got, well, actually, even if you have any one child, we'll be talking about, equity and fairness. But the topic of favoritism, yeah, it is really difficult. I was talking to somebody actually just a couple of days ago about mismatch between parent and child and how our temperament can be very different to our child. And so we can experience a mismatch. And in the same way, our temperament can be very similar to another one of our children, and we can feel very, very well matched. Mm-hmm. And that can mean that it can be easier to parent one child versus another. It also, means that it can change. It's not like it's fixed. You could be mismatched in the toddler years and then be quite well matched in teenage years, if you're lucky. So it can change, but not to get too attached to your feelings. Like just because you feel more connected or it feels easier to parent a child doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. I think that's really important. And just because your child thinks that there's favoritism doesn't mean that there is. Although John's sort of quick to tell us to be very mindful and to be very curious as to why your child might be saying that. Even though it's not your intention, why do they perceive favoritism? Now, Katie was talking about, the function of that too. A child saying, like, I was reflecting on my children saying that one of them is a favorite. What are they trying to say to me? But also, what are they trying to evoke as well? Mm-hmm. What do they want out of me with that comment?
What's the intent?
What's the intent exactly? Because it's definitely a trigger.
It's meant to be.
It's meant to be, absolutely. Really is meant to be.
So yeah. Katie recommended examining our rules in our families, be more contextually sensitive, and also, talking to our kids about equitability and, what is fairness and what fairness isn't. And you're not going to prevent your child from seeing favoritism when they see it, but we can have those conversations and create an environment where the kids feel at least heard and perhaps understand a little bit better about where the parents are coming from.
Really is a wicked environment, isn't it? Just listening to you talk about that, and I can see how, on the one hand, we want to have these conversations about equity and fairness, and that things can sometimes feel unfair, but it's equitable. Like, for example, my, children, I have, different ages. And so my eldest will complain about my youngest getting more help and more support. And that is, equitable because she needs it, because she's smaller, but it feels unfair.
If by fair, he means equal.
If by fair, he means equal, exactly. But we can have these conversations with our children and they can still not be happy. they can still be unhappy with the outcome of the conversation because they didn't think that we're on the right side or they don't agree with us. So that's why I guess, yeah, it really is wicked, even when with the best intentions, we can't control the outcomes.
Well, making our children happy can't be the goal.
No, or making them like us all the time.
Yeah.
Also, unfortunately, although I would like it. But the cost to that, I'd probably have to spend all day buying them ice cream. And even then, not sure they'd like me all the time. They get fed up with the ice cream. It's pretty hard to be liked all the time. Not sure it's possible. But yeah, it's definitely something that feels incredibly uncomfortable. Disappointing our children, getting their disapproval is hard.
Yeah. Tough love sometimes.
So yes, important.
Then we had Elisabeth Lati.
Oh, yes.
Gentle power, the Finnish concept of Sisu. That was a very interesting conversation.
It was. She's so interesting as well. Her whole, her background of these sort of ultra marathons and how, she's tested her body in so many different ways. And I'd never heard of Sisu.
Defined as extraordinary determination in the face of extreme adversity. We tap into Sisu when we feel like there's nothing left in the tank.
Yes. And she talked about that sort of reserve of power which we all harbor to get through some of the most challenging of moments. And she actually thought she felt that parenting was a great example of Sisu. And probably there's many others, but we did reflect on parenting and I remember thinking that when I became a parent, before I was a parent, I was so precious about how I slept and how I ate and my self-care and blah, blah, blah. And suddenly you can't do any of it. You just have to, wake up at insane hours and do whatever the baby, like you have a dictator in the household, practically suddenly. And you have to give up on what you thought was so critical to your survival. And suddenly you make it. You spend the first 6 weeks sleeping on nothing.
So she talked about examining where our life force, our Sisu, is getting thwarted or squeezed down, and talked a lot about, the importance of self-care, having an action mindset, taking us into the unknown. I really liked that. And again, it's kind of, the leaps of faith, as we talked about.
That's right.
But yeah, and it's embodied, not cognitive, which I thought was interesting. And it's not an intellectual exercise. It really comes from deep down.
Do you think that's the same as, because we then went on to talk about values, didn't we, with her, whether that's what she would define as values? Like, if I think back to the parenting expert example, I guess you just do. When you become a parent, you just get up in the middle of the night, or you just, find a way to, help them when they're sick, even though you're exhausted. You just do it. Like, there's not a lot of thinking that gets.
No, something happens. I mean, an ambulance can go down the street, and it doesn't wake you up, but your child sniffles in the next room and you're wide awake. So something, again, that embodied piece that our brain, our whole nervous system gets retuned in some way. Even the men, even the fathers.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And you just do it. You just do it. And I guess what's the other part of it was, she talked about, yes, our mindset in Sisu is really, and the courage allows us to transform what appears to be impossible into stepping stones for our personal growth. So we can find ourselves being able to do things that we really didn't expect with that inner life force. And I guess the values piece comes in because that directs us. What is it that we want to use our Sisu for? Because she talks about leadership in Sisu, which I thought was really important. Like the importance of using your position of power wisely.
Well, because we got into the dark side of Sisu, and that was one of them where it can become harmful to the environment, imposing our standards on other people. It can be harmful to us when we become, merciless with ourselves, and that can lead to burnout, feeling overextended. And she said it can also lead to stubbornness and rigidity. Because she said Sisu can actually manifest as giving up when giving up is the right thing to do.
Wow.
So,
yeah, because it can take a lot of courage to give up.
I saw a bumper sticker years ago that said, "I didn't give up, I surrendered."
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes saying no, turning things down, stopping, taking a break, incredibly bold and courageous moves.
Yeah, yielding. And she too brought up the idea of a dance, a dynamic interplay between ourselves and the world and other people.
And I guess that's when Sisu, when it gets insensitive, right? We talk about that insensitivity to context. A bit like the perfectionism, right? When this sort of determination of this life force gets very insensitive to what's actually happening and how it's actually working. When we get too perfectionistic, and inflexible, it leads to burnout. Yeah, that excess grit can be too much. So it really is a dance.
And then moving on to Amy Beddows, victim blame. That was a tough one.
Yeah, it was a tough conversation, important one, but quite uncomfortable too. I found it very difficult to reconcile, although I see it in the clinic room, the fact that victims often feel blamed. Not only do they blame themselves, but they feel blamed, and that is actually true. That it's real. That victims are blamed for what's happened to them. And that's very uncomfortable.
Can be quite overt. The questions that are asked, like, were you drinking, and why did you park in that, unlit area? And even things that are unintentional. The example of the police officers in the hospital who are standing with their arms folded across their chests, which is body language that's defensive or aggressive, but they're standing that way because they can't put their arms at their sides because
that was incredible.
Their belts with all their gear on them, and they were shocked to hear that the way they were standing would be interpreted as intimidating or in some way not supportive.
Yes, that was incredible, wasn't it? And yes, I thought when we were thinking about, how systemic victim blame is and how difficult it is so going back to this idea that it is very hard for us to see victims, like it's very painful to be with somebody who has been a victim of sexual violence, physical violence. It's much easier for us to find a reason why it happened to them. So it's a very ego-centric perspective to try and protect your own feelings because you don't want to be a victim yourself. So it's easier for us to find a way to blame or find some sense of responsibility. It happened because they walked down that dark alley, or it happened to them because of what they were wearing or the kind of person they are. Like finding something in that person that led to that horrible outcome is very protective.
Well, yeah, and it gets back to that me versus them mentality.
Yeah, the good and evil. I was just thinking that too. Because when we think about some of the systemic issues as well, where people who work with victims are often burnt out. It's really hard work.
Well, yeah, and the caseloads are enormous and wait lists are long. And she mentioned that it could take 3 years for a case to come to trial, even if it ever does. And so that's just more, heaping more, stress on the individual.
Yes.
And I'm even a bit uncomfortable with the word victim.
Yeah.
I think I would prefer to use survivor, but I know, that victims of sexual violence, victims of domestic violence. I know that that's a common term, and we'll probably never replace it with anything else, but it's sort of in and of itself.
I agree. Although I also think that victims don't get to feel like real victims.
How so? Tell me more.
I think that when you've experienced sexual violence or you've been a victim of crime or whatever that might have happened, we don't give them the opportunity to really feel like they were a victim. They were powerless over it. They have no responsibility. This wasn't something that should have happened and it was wrong. Instead, we quickly try and figure out how it happened, why it happened, and trying to figure it out doesn't give the victim opportunity to really feel that powerlessness and how wrong it was. And to me, that's an important stage.
Right. I mean, Stephen Porges, who came up with the vagal nerve theory, he gave a talk at the big annual ACT conference in San Francisco a few years ago. And he was talking about how when people are undergoing a traumatic experience, they can become paralyzed, essentially.
Yes.
And
physically, right?
Physically paralyzed. And he had a woman write to him and say, "Thank you, because everybody says I should have fought back."
That's right.
And his saying you were physically incapable of fighting back at that moment was incredibly validating. But there it is too. It's like, well, why don't you just cry out? Why don't you fight back?
I hear it so often, even with sort of individuals who've had child sexual abuse, and they say, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I shout? There were 5 or 6. So I do think that there's something important about the label victim. It doesn't, I mean, then you become a survivor, but the first part is really feeling that you're a victim and this shouldn't have happened and you couldn't have done anything to stop it from happening.
It was just flat out wrong.
Flat out wrong. Exactly. And and it's incredibly unfair that victims experience so much blame. And I think going back to the conversation that, we had with Stephen Batchelor, not to get too categorical and then put the blame on all the people that work with victims that are also often experiencing vicarious trauma, really overwhelmed with the services, went into this work because they believed that they could do something good and something important, and then encountered an incredibly unfair, ineffective environment, wicked there too. So not to sort of start pointing fingers and actually being able to, like Stephen Batchelor was inviting us to, look at it all, not to get too binary.
And finally, she had some recommendations for all of us in how we can be helpful. She said, engage, slow down. If you're working with a victim, a survivor, offer them a cup of tea and a biscuit.
Oh.
And for all the listeners here in the States, a biscuit just means a cookie.
It's so British.
And because when we think of biscuits, we usually think of something you give to your dog.
Oh, really? Oh, that's hilarious. I didn't know that.
It's a dog treat. But get informed, recognize your own biases and prejudices, and be able to hold that discomfort lightly. Like you were saying, we're uncomfortable when people are victimized because it's a little too close to home. And rather than trying to do all those self-protective moves that are invalidating, to be able to hold that discomfort, dance with it, and be there for the person.
Yeah, the compassion for ourselves, right, too.
Right.
This is very difficult for us and them. So the next one, neurodivergence. That was
Jennifer
fantastic.
Camp.
Yeah, I was so excited about getting this opportunity. Obviously, since that conversation, I see neurodivergence everywhere, including in myself.
Well, I thought it was interesting that there was that she talked about the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergence. and that essentially we're all neurodiverse because we all have these incredibly complex brains that are all somewhat different. But neurodivergence kind of gets back to the whole Stephen Hayes "what's normal" thing.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. It's a really, in thinking about the social justice piece, right? And equity, being able to now be moving, because the way we were educated was, we were trained in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, thinking about disorders and ADHD and autism being disorders. And now this movement around understanding the neurodivergence in a way that it's just, there are differences in how the brain, what drives people with neurodivergence, such as ADHD and ASD, versus what drives a neurotypical brain, that there's that difference. And I thought it was a wonderful invitation to start thinking about difference and not disorder. And,
getting back to that, seeing people at the level of the individual.
Exactly. Coming back to Steve Hayes' conversation. And what I thought was really important was our conversation on, the different types of neurodivergence. I didn't know OCD was in there, but that makes complete sense.
Schizophrenia, epilepsy.
Yes. Yeah. Incredible. I didn't know that, which, it's quite validating of some of the work that we've done, clinically in the room. I just find it so much more validating generally to be thinking more on an individual level than in norms, because I don't want to be having to fit into a category or not, personally.
Well, as you know, my wife, Sue, is a geriatric psychologist who works a lot with people with dementia and their caregivers. And what they say in dementia work is if you meet one person with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's.
That's right. Makes for complicated work, but it's real.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that surprised me was Jennifer talked about the higher mortality and morbidity rates among people who are neurodivergent. And it's not just the stress that they chronically experience trying to be square pegs in round holes day after day, but, they have autoimmune issues, allergies, chronic pain, gut and musculoskeletal issues. And that was news to me. And
me too.
Wow.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, because she was saying if you're neurodivergent in every cell of your body.
I think of the cases that I've worked with over the years, it makes complete sense because that was very much the case. As in the cases that have, ADHDers or ASD mostly actually have a long list of physical ailments and issues, especially allergies and gut issues. But I didn't know about the musculoskeletal issues, but, and incredible amounts of stress. And I think that stress piece is really important. I also love the conversation we had about, the executive function.
That was very important.
Yeah.
Because, executive functions or executive skills, because they're skills, you can teach them and you can get better at them if you practice them. So things like attention management, which I think is what ADHD really is. It's not a deficit. It's an attention management problem. That's an executive skill. Impulse control, perspective taking, all of those things.
Yes, absolutely. They are all skills. And this idea that ADHDers, and because we were mostly talking about ADHD and autism, are driven by interests and they have this hyper focus. And she talked about authenticity, that is me. I love geology, or she talked about how she loves psychology and the study of human behavior. And when you have the topic of interest, that they can get very hyper focused. And, knowing that and understanding that can be very validating, that's just what drives me, as opposed to there's something wrong with me that I'm so fascinated by the study of dinosaurs or whatever it might be, that's their topic of interest, that is just me. And finding your tribe of others who are also interested is really important, as opposed to, and I thought was very powerful, is to think about, neurodivergence isn't a mental health issue, although they're more likely to have a mental health issue. The mental health problems come when they're not able to be themselves, when they have to mask, pretend to be something else. And I was really struck by the statistics she gave around the stereotypy behaviors, the hand flapping, the need for that helps individuals on the spectrum self-regulate, and then where children were stopped when they weren't able to engage in these behaviors and they're fidgeting or whatever it was that helps them regulate, they were more likely to have anxiety issues by the age of 10. And I was really struck by that. Like, I remember being trained when I used to work in developmental disorders. A big part of our work was interfering with those behaviors because those behaviors were getting in the way of their ability to write or their ability to play appropriately. And I remember we used to work really hard to find competing behaviors for them. Chewy toys, whatever it was, something that was a more appropriate way of stimming. But thinking about the mental health cost of that is, it's really sad. And I guess it's, coming back to, being able to be ourselves and the individuals that we are and finding the tribe that will accept us for who we are.
She talked about learning self-advocacy skill. She has a book coming out, I guess, next month. The Neurodivergent Skills Workbook for Autism and ADHD. And the listeners can find a link to that on the show notes on our website for Jennifer Kemp's episode.
And she also spoke about, I'm going on. I'm so excited by this topic. I just thought it was a brilliant conversation. She also talked about that support piece, that recognizing that if you are neurodivergent, you might need more support and that's okay. And you need your team around you if you can. And she talked about having a whole load of support. She had an admin, she has a gardener, she's got her accountant in order to function. Her husband, And I thought that was really validating. That it's okay. It's okay to need those things.
And as so many of us do.
To be honest, I was like, I could do with a PA. I think I might just look into that. My life would be a bit easier. Absolutely. It's like giving ourselves permission to be. It's really hard when we don't.
Jonathan Caspi.
Oh, yes.
That was one of my favorite ones. Siblings. But that was very interesting, in part because he was asking us a lot of questions, particularly at the beginning. He was interviewing us, and we were doing a lot of self-disclosing. But that was so interesting that, siblings are more different from each other than any, random strangers that you can put them up against in terms of, the standard measures about personality and what have you, which, we can have a whole discussion about the value of the concept of personality. But the idea that siblings are very different from one another, and his point was that they are different from one another because of one another.
Yes.
And the labeling that goes on, being the not that, the shy one versus the outgoing one, the studious one versus the slacker. So we get labeled, and then we assume that role. And again, that whole comparison piece. And we talked a lot about favoritism as being a driver of sibling aggression.
Yeah, horrendous, actually. The piece around sibling aggression was very disturbing, and how much it's condoned and accepted that, siblings will be violent with each other. And yet the impact of sibling violence is horrendous, lifelong, and traumatic. And he talked about how the impact is the same as witnessing any violence. No, actually, he said it's actually worse because you're trapped in it. You have no escape. and the people who are meant to be protecting you aren't.
And he said that intervening can actually exacerbate the situation. So parents are in a no-win situation when it comes to this. However, he has a book coming out
With all the answers
for parents on how to deal with sibling aggression. So no doubt there will be some good stuff in there. But he did talk about, dealing proactively instead of, on the fly, instead of just reacting to things. So laying out the expectations and the rules, noticing good behavior. He had a lot to say about the fact that when our children are behaving themselves, they get ignored. But as soon as they start acting out, that's when the attention comes in, which can be reinforcing in and of itself. But if the parent intervenes and appears to be taking sides, then it builds up that resentment and that perception of favoritism. And then a vicious cycle gets created.
And it's so easy to do that. And I talked about that it's so easy if you see any aggression towards one of your children, maybe the younger one, for you to sort of start defending that younger one and sort of taking sides. It's just really hard. And I think really one can separate them without necessarily accusing anybody. And you can sort of separate the children, stop them from fighting. And once they've calmed down, talk about it, but not to get involved and start blaming and finger pointing, because you don't have the whole picture. But it's very difficult.
Very difficult.
Very
difficult.
So
you can find a link to Dr. Caspi's book in the show notes.
Yeah. And the other thing I thought was beautiful, the last thing to comment on, was the impact that siblings' relationships have on longevity and happiness.
Oh, yeah.
It was lovely. I don't think we talk about that enough. That, siblings are really good for us. When the relationship is a good one, it's incredibly protective. Like he talked about in divorce, very difficult divorces, it basically protects you from the impact of the divorce if you have a strong sibling relationship.
Or just any kind of challenging family situation, because you have somebody to commiserate with or to do a little reality check, or, somebody to shrug and say, yeah, dad's being a jerk today, but, it'll be okay tomorrow. So, that's hugely important to have that kind of validation and support.
And I think as parents, it's really important to remember that we want to, as much as possible, encourage their relationship, like help them feel more connected, and be very mindful of the piece around comparison, blaming, putting each other down, and instead work on supporting their relationship. So that's really, it's
even
great for their well-being.
Even allowing them to conspire against us.
Yeah, it's nothing like them versus us. Games. So true. But I don't think we think about it as much as we should as parents. The impact we can have on the sibling relationship. We are quite responsible for how they get on.
And then?
Was Robin Walser, another fabulous guest, of course. Some of us know her from all her work in ACT. We talked about narcissism. And that was another brilliant conversation. And what I loved is to think about the sort of the role of narcissists in our society, like why it is that we get so drawn into the kind of hold of narcissists, what makes them incredibly good at getting followers and capturing people's attention and influence.
Said they can be charming and funny, at least at the beginning, but then, there's, the gaslighting, which Robin also said was a term that's being overused these days, along with narcissism. But over-promising things, and then when those things are not delivered, blame is shifted around and a new story comes out, and they get pulled back into the cult or, the political party or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's incredible. Her conversation about how, narcissists can be incredibly convincing of their ability to solve our problems, be it in a political party or a leadership role or in a relationship. Like, they will fix it. We just have to trust them and believe in them. And that's how we get drawn into their hold, really. And especially when resources are low. I thought that was really interesting because I do think, and I mean, there's always been figures in history that you would say have narcissistic traits, if not full-blown narcissists. But of late, it feels like, there's a lot.
Well, it seems like, in the last 30, 40 years or so, we've been celebrating narcissists through the whole, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have People magazine, and there's always been like celebrities, but it seems like people are being celebrated for being celebrities, whether it's the Kardashians or
Right.
Donald Trump. I mean, he had a great PR team, and he had his TV show, and he just parlayed that into, the highest levels of power. But we've elevated a lot of people, the people who admire billionaires, whether it's Bill Gates or Elon Musk or whatever. And I think in part it's we want to have a little bit of that rub off on us, but by association, I can feel powerful too, or at least I've got somebody who's going to smite mine enemies for me.
That's right. And that resources piece, when we are low on resources, we want somebody that can help us get access to more resources. Like, there's the threat, and the narcissistic can help you feel confident that you will not have to experience the threat. So be it in a relationship, Robin talked about, people who are over empaths and potentially have had, difficult upbringings, are seduced by the narcissistic's ability to reassure and convince that they will make everything right. Or in political parties and leadership that, I will fix the problem. I will make this bad thing go away. Just trust me, just be with me. And I think the sad part of the conversation was how difficult it is once you're under the trance of a narcissist to actually come out. That it can be, narcissists can be incredibly, especially if they're the malignant type, can be incredibly cruel and find a way to blame you.
Well, because, over a period of time, you've probably become isolated. You're probably, not getting disconfirming opinions from anybody. You're only reading certain newspapers or watching certain sources of news, and everything else is propaganda or, fake news or whatever. And so, again, it goes back to the binary good and evil, us versus them thing. And there's power in that.
Yeah.
It's scary.
It is scary. It's really scary. And going back to the conversation with Stephen Batchelor, how do we move forward when our human brain has this sort of very tribal lens where we want to be part of the good guys or the guys that will, we feel very easily threatened and scared and worried about our well-being, our future, our safety. And that's how we get sucked into the hold of, more narcissistic personality. But how do we, because one of the ways out is finding, you have to be incredibly brave. If you are in a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, it requires a lot of courage because you do almost get disorientated by the narcissistic's perspective on the world and on you, right? The gaslighting is very confusing.
You doubt yourself, you doubt your own reality.
That's right. That's right. And so finding a tribe of people that get what that's like and know what you're going through and know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. That was so important, what Robin said. You're not crazy for feeling like this. It is not you. It's really important. And she did reference a couple of resources like Surviving Narcissism, I think is a website with some videos.
It's a YouTube channel, Surviving Narcissism. And it's, for people who are in relationships with narcissists that they perhaps can't just sever, such as a parent, or maybe an ex that you're co-parenting with, unfortunately. So there's a link to that YouTube channel in the show notes for Robin's episode. Yes,
really important. But I guess when it comes to politically, the narcissists in this world that are, in political positions, we can't escape them. But hopefully, going back to Stephen Batchelor's conversation, how can we get more cooperative?
Yes.
And more empowered that, we're better together versus a more tribalistic view that sort of narcissist leaders encourage.
Yes, we shall see.
That's the world. That's the world I want. Okay, so for our episode number 30, we had the pleasure of inviting Diana Hill back in for a really fun and enlightening conversation on wise effort, which I loved how she introduced it, that it had been a labor of love, the work that she's been doing, but she talked about how it had been delivered through forceps, how it had been something that was quite effortful, actually, to work on. But yeah, it was I love the concept. I love the idea of thinking about the work that we do wisely, be it where we're putting effort in our lives wisely, not. And I think it ties into burnout. It ties into the concept of perfectionism. It ties into so many other conversations that we've had with our wonderful guests.
And she said that it's essentially a Buddhist concept and how to use your life force. And she even mentioned Sisu. So again, all these convergences.
It's true. It's true. She did mention it. And I love this idea that with wise effort, the energy, she spoke a lot about energy and how energy isn't just depleted. We can get energy out of the work and the effort that we put into our lives in different areas of our lives. And I thought that was so important because we often think about just how we're depleted throughout the day and actually thinking about what is actually energizing us, giving us energy and actually filling us up. And that can be in the area of work or parenting or sports, whatever it might be. But just to be mindful of that part too.
At the end, she talked about the climate activist, Christiana Figueres, and how she talked about the concepts of endless abundance, radical regeneration, which again is, I think, where that energy replenishing comes from, and then stubborn optimism.
I love that.
I thought was a great concept.
I love that. Stubborn optimism.
And spaciousness.
Yeah.
Instead of gripping too tightly, whether it's because of, we're caught up in our concepts and self-stories or rules that we have, but to just be more open, spacious.
That curiosity again came back. The conversation included approaching life generally with curiosity and openness, asking ourselves, what is this actually doing for me? Like the example that she gave that her client had spoken about, I feel like I do so much and yet it's never enough, is so true. Like, what is this? What are the returns from what I'm putting in? Am I continuing to get what I want out of this activity or this exchange? And that can help us think about how much energy and effort we want to put into something.
She mentioned worth it, not worth it.
Yeah.
This reminds me of something somebody said a while back. Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah, I like that.
So we have season 3.
Yes.
That will be coming out early summer. And we've got some great people scheduled already. We've got Russell Colts, psychologist here in Washington State, who will be talking about masculinity.
Yes. Such an important conversation with the sort of crisis that we're seeing in men's mental health.
Then we have an interesting pair coming up, Jennifer Tosti-Karas and Christopher Michelson. Jennifer is a psychologist who works in management, and Michelson is a philosopher who also does management ethics, business ethics, and they've written a book called Is Your Work Worth It? And we'll be talking to them about their book and their thoughts on work, which should be very interesting. And then we're going to have an episode on the secret power of disagreements.
Oh, yes.
And that's Gail Schonbrun, right?
Yes.
Okay, she's great.
Amazing. She's great.
So we're looking forward to some very interesting conversations with some very smart, interesting people.
Yes, we're very lucky. Once again, we get to be inspired and educated by phenomenal people in the field that just give us a different perspective on important topics.
So please join us for season 3, and thank you for listening.
That's right. Thank you very much, all of you. It's been an amazing year and 3 months, and we're still here, still doing it. Great. See you all in season 3.
See you then.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.